we recommend that you really look into this because Bitcoin's role as a strategic global asset, I don't think it can be overstated as we see federal governments, we see Wall Street, we see financial markets, all these different parties starting to realize this and running through the door. Countries or entities that fail to adapt, there is the risk of losing influence.
Imagine a world where the future of your country's power and prosperity hinges on a single decision: adopting Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. That future could be now. This isn't just about diversification or hedging against inflation. It's a high-stakes game of global influence. From groundbreaking state legislation in Texas and Pennsylvania, even Ohio, to a federal bill proposing Bitcoin to pay off trillions in debt. Cities, states, and nations are racing to secure their place in the next era of finance. And with transparency tools like proof of reserves, the rules of accountability are being rewritten. Stay tuned as we dive deep into the policies, power plays, and practices shaping the future of money, and what happens next could change the world for the next century. Welcome to TNF Takes, the go-to spot for crypto companies and on-chain organizations. Today, we have a special episode for crypto countries, Bitcoin states, and on-chain municipalities. Before we dive in, if you like this content, make sure to like and subscribe so you continue getting top-tier content for your crypto company or on-chain organization from industry experts who have been around the block. I'm one of those people, Noah Buxton from the network firm, and I'm here with my co-host and co-founder and partner, Jeremy Nau. We're here to help you establish trust, build efficient crypto operations, and stay ahead of the curve in an ever-evolving industry. Well, Jeremy, first off, good morning.
Good morning. Wow, what a day to be alive. I would never have thought that we'd be here having this conversation. Very excited to get into it today.
This is one thing that wasn't on my bingo card even recently, frankly. So, all right. I mean, yeah, it seems hard to believe, right? Like 3 US states have already introduced Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, or SBR, we'll call them maybe for shorthand today, bills. The US federal government is contemplating, or at least there's proposed legislation for a buy of 1 million Bitcoins over a 5-year period. And the concept of a strategic Bitcoin reserve has definitely caught some fire in social media and in pop culture. Again, even in legislatures here as this legislation is being proposed. So who would have thought this 5 years ago? I don't think basically anybody, even 6 months ago, right? Like, again, this wasn't on my bingo card. So how did we end up in this spot? Like, what brought us here? I want to hear how you contextualize this.
Yeah, from my view, there was murmurs in about July before the Bitcoin 2024 conference that there was going to be a big announcement, right? Something big was going to happen. And there were some big speakers planned. Lummis, RFK, Vivek, they were all planning to go to the Bitcoin conference. But last minute, Donald Trump decided that he was going to speak there too. But of course, he gave his speech, but really there was Cynthia, Lummis, and RFK. They announced plans to create basically a strategic, or an SBR, strategic Bitcoin reserve that would buy 1 million Bitcoins over a 5-year period for Lummis's bill. And RFK, he was even more bullish. He wanted to buy 4 million Bitcoin, which is 20% of the outstanding supply or more today. So this is where the murmurs actually became real in these speeches that Lummis introduced this bill into the House, I believe. And then right after that, after these speeches by Lummis and RFK, Trump comes on stage and talks about how he wants to make all the Bitcoin in America and make America the crypto capital of the world, and that he wants the crypto people to have fun with all their crypto. So just a very different tune than what we were used to for the last 4 years.
And I think you're going to get into sort of, a little bit more about, I anticipate you're going to Trump's influence. So yeah, Cynthia Lummis, senator from the state of Wyoming, has long been a Bitcoin proponent generally. Like, she's been, I think, out there early in engaging with the industry for years now. And she's even sort of said publicly, like, how much Bitcoin she owns, right? It's a very modest amount. But she also has discussed she has a long career in state government, and then as a state senator and representative, and was treasurer actually of Wyoming, I believe, as well for a period of time. So like she has a very deep understanding of sort of the state administration, the state treasury aspect of this. So I think that there's a lot more there under the hood in terms of so the other thing is, like the coalition of sort of the alignment of the 2 and 3 branches of government that we're going to see post January 6th, right, is going to be very much different. Republicans in control of Senate and House and have a pretty favorable Supreme Court, I would say, makeup. So it seems like these things are, while they're totally wild to believe, they're actually quite possible when it comes. So I think legislation is going to it's going to go through the meat grinder of a process, I'm sure, and change. But it seems like it's very possible, right?
Yeah, certainly. This isn't just, this wasn't a random senator or House of Representatives member introducing a bill. It's someone that had experience, someone that's been involved with the industry for sure. And this can actually happen because after, an assassination attempt, legal challenges, Trump actually wins the election come November, right? And then, since then, his family and his close confidants have taken a very pro Bitcoin, pro crypto stance. His family and himself have contributed to the launch of a DeFi project, World Liberty Financial. I would have never thought I'd be saying that. Buying millions of dollars of ETH and Chainlink and other currencies that can be seen on chain, right? His wallet's tagged, which is amazing to see. And then,
you forgot to mention the NFTs.
Of course, the Trump NFTs.
Probably the most valuable of them all, right?
Yeah, I need to check out what the floor is on those. It's been a while, but it's just a completely different tune. And then you look at the people in his or positions of power that he's been talking to or been nominating, including, of course, JD Vance as the VP. You have Vivek and Elon in the Doge, Scott Bessent, Tulsi Gabbard, Robert F. Kennedy, as mentioned before. Like, you have very pro Bitcoin people. Of course, not all of them are going to be directly related to, call it the crypto czar role that David Sachs just got nominated for, right? You have the surrounding of people in the administration that look to have this very pro Bitcoin stance. So it seems like there's going to be a complete 180 compared to what we're seeing with the last 4 years, and this will likely have global implications for the future of money, commodities, technology. Of course, in the U.S., but the U.S. seems to lead in a lot of these areas, and other people seem to follow or are affected by the U.S. So this is definitely going to have global implications going forward. So it seems like kind of when we would read the books about, the Bitcoin standard or the sovereign individual, and you were going to see this game theory kind of play out where once people realized what Bitcoin was and what digital assets and the future of technology could be, that it was almost going to be like a race, once people realize that, to who can entrench themselves of being a leader in that future world where this is the dominant technology, this is the dominant money. So this is going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. People were thinking that El Salvador and Bhutan maybe were being irresponsible with their company or their country's funds, but now, maybe they were just the test cases that these other countries could look towards to actually prove the point out that it's a viable strategy.
I wish I had looked that up before our chat this morning. Total buys, and also their current sort of state of their balance sheet, basically cost basis and what they would be on a mark to market basis right now. I'm not sure if you did
I did not, but I know they're up because I think they started buying, probably 40 at the up near the last cycle, but they rode it all the way down. They were buying 1 Bitcoin a day, right through the bear.
Exactly. Yeah. Imagine exactly. That's my gut feeling, right? Is the returns are pretty good here. I'll add one thing on the politics, right? Like, we're not political consultants. I feel like we know a little bit about politics. So I'm not sure we can predict any of that, right? But what we do want to get into today is a review of these SBR bills and kind of give folks a lay of the land to the best that we can. We hope some, nation state leaders, policymakers, cabinet members across the world end up seeing this video and take some insight from it. I personally, I'll just put in a personal comment here. I like to see politicians, public servants, be unconflicted. I think like the business we work in, right? Like we perform financial statement audit services, attestation services under recognized standards. Professional services is at our core. Like professional responsibility and professional standards are at our core. And with comes ethics and being free from conflicts and being independent,
right?
Yeah. Independent in your work. And so that's one thing with Trump. Like, gosh, on the one hand, like the commitment to the industry seems to be like, I wasn't swayed by the Bitcoin speech at Bitcoin Nashville. Frankly, I wasn't, because like I didn't know if that was real. But now it seems like sort of the additional policy pronouncements and support are definitely there. So it seems like he's going to put his money where his mouth is. So I think that's a thumbs up for sure. The sort of personal involvement in this, in stuff, having a personal stake, I wish it was a bit more of a blind trust sort of aspect, you know, because I think that would present it a bit more legitimately as opposed to sort of in a self-interested way. But ultimately, I think what we're going to get to today is whether he's a little bit self-interested or not, the reality around a strategic Bitcoin reserve could actually be such a game changer for countries that do this the right way, right? So, and even in state governments that we'll talk about.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that gets us to the next point, right? You know, we've been talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve, but what is that even to begin with? And why might a city, a state, or a country even consider an SBR, Noah? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, so maybe just definitionally first, right? So like a strategic reserve or a Bitcoin strategic reserve in it itself is a municipality, a government, a city, state, country holding a financial asset or a commodity, either essentially on its balance sheet, right? So part of the nation's asset makeup. Of course, people, when they think about reserves, they probably remember pre 1970, roughly, right? The gold standard, and that being a gold reserve, which was tied to the dollar. So that was also a reserve. Like the strategic reserve, I tend to think actually of like oil as a good example. The US has a national strategic reserve for oil, not as a financial asset, but really more for national security and even domestic security, right? Having access to petroleum. So slightly different, but essentially in a financial context, a Bitcoin strategic reserve is a hedge against inflation. It's a diversification into a digital commodity asset class, which is a modernizing, I think, of reserve assets. And it can play a store of value function, is the idea here, right? So people are going to grapple with these topics and think, can it really hedge against inflation? Is that a diversification worth making? Is it really a store of value if it's volatile? Those are all things we're talking through, but just generally, that's the idea. So now I think the other piece of this is I had a conversation, another podcast with an accounting industry influencer, great guy, great conversationalist, but a total Bitcoin skeptic. And we had a great conversation, I think, now just a couple of weeks ago. It's on YouTube if you want to look it up, with Blake Oliver. But this topic kind of came up of what is this really about? Like in the nation state context, this is really about power and influence. And we say veiled in a meme. I'll give Jeremy, I'm going to give you credit for this idea because you nailed it. It's this veiled in the meme of magic internet money. So again, if you are a nation state leader, if you're a policymaker, I don't want that to dissuade you. Wait a second, meme sounds terrible. But I think this kind of sets us up to understand that look at some of the most economically valuable things in our world today, or the things that generate the most attention and therefore generate the most ad revenue, or some of the most successful businesses, right? They're memes, right? I mean, and so sometimes this is not about necessarily, it is about fundamentals, right? But like, it's also about the meme on top of fundamentals. It's about where the attention is, where the interest is, where the momentum is. And so, yeah, currency choices, go ahead.
Social and cultural influence, right? It cannot be denied in this case. And
Exactly.
it's like when people talk about nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. It's like the idea is pushed forward by a very loud set of proponents or, adoptees. And that's what we're seeing here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's true. The vocal minority sometimes has an outsized impact too. Like I know that's one political science thing I know. And so, yeah, I mean, when we think about the future of money, I think like currency choices can shape national dominance for centuries, right? I think that there's many examples of this from sort of the Spanish Empire through to the United Kingdom, England's conquests and ability to control territory and be a powerful nation state. And of course, the US, right? And the US's leadership as an economic superpower, as a production powerhouse, as an international trade partner that everyone wants to work with. And of course, global dollar hegemony and our markets being a safe place to invest, right? yeah, I mean, nations that adopted gold thrived. Those relying on lesser assets, right? Beads, salt, other commodities fell behind economically, generally speaking, over that sort of course of history that I talked about. And wealthier nations what could they do? They could buy up land, they could buy up resources. Frankly, some of the stuff that came with that was not necessarily great. There's some human suffering potentially, right, that comes with that. Hopefully, we don't have that in our modern era. But yeah, the other country's purchasing power on its own fiat currency eroding against a nation state that doesn't have an eroding purchase power or has strong reserve asset position. Yeah, there's a misbalance there for sure.
Yeah. It's about the harder money, right? Who's operating on a harder money? Because if you just think about it like the simplest concept, right? If you were in the Renaissance in Italy or in Spain and you're using gold or silver, and you go to Africa, right, where they're using gold or glass beads, you could simply print their glass beads and buy up all of their land, buy up all their valuables in that whole country. And you're essentially taking over a country without even shooting a gun or having any hand-to-hand combat, right? So over time, history has demonstrated that the country operating on the harder money, right, or the more adopted money, is the one that will be more economically prosperous and militarily prosperous. And we've seen that such a huge part of the U.S.'s global position in the last century has been because of they were first, the backed by gold and the whole linchpin of the Bretton Woods Agreement. But now that they're the hegemony as well, right? They've been able to exert so much influence over the world, over the banking system. Basically, everyone in the world wants dollars, right? Think about how much power that gives a country. So that's why this is so important. Is that you have to make this right economic decision, or else it's going to have global impacts for the economy and standard of living for your people.
Right. Yeah. So in this section, we basically brought up there's a meme, there's a momentum aspect of this, there's a vocal minority aspect of this and growing interest in it, there's a trend aspect to it. There's also what you mentioned is essentially the Austrian economic hard money fundamentals of this, right? Which can be denounced in every time that times are good, right? And can't be ignored when times are bad. That's the history of Austrian economics to me, Weimar, just as this standout example. And so, yeah, so this is what we have today. I feel like the way to cap this off is I don't think it can be understated that this is actually an incredibly important decision that a country can make right now for its future prospects, for its people and the future prosperity of its people for, the next 10, 50, and arguably a century, right? The pivotal moment. So yeah, it's kind of surreal to be talking about it. That's on the nation state level. What about thinking about strategic reserves at the state level?
Yeah. So, I mean, what's been really interesting to see is that we heard the announcement from the US at the federal level in July. But since then, November, December, there were actually bills introduced at the state level. Oftentimes, the states could be a little bit more nimble and move a little bit more quickly, and they're not relying on a transition of power. So, we've seen 3 states introduce bills, and I want to go over some of the key, unique nuances of each of these. I think it would be great to give our listeners just some, hey, what do they need to know about these bills? And those 3 states are Pennsylvania, Texas, and Ohio. And the first one that introduced a strategic Bitcoin or an SBR bill was Pennsylvania in November of this year. So about a month ago, right? They were the first to do this. And it was interesting when we look at this bill text, it almost starts with like a manifesto or a treatise on inflation, eroding of purchasing power. It is very much almost like a Bitcoin manifesto or you read it out of the Bitcoin standard, really, right? It's all those same reasons why you might look at Bitcoin. And the bill itself is actually pretty short, right? It's 3-4 pages of actual text, and the key components of it is that it authorizes the state treasurer to invest up to 10% of the state's funds from there. There's like a general fund, a state stabilization fund. There's a couple different buckets of money that the state treasurer can actually invest up to 10% of those funds in Bitcoin. Now, how you might do that, we'll get into some of the details. Of course, there's like custodial considerations, who's going to hold the private keys, all these different things. And this bill doesn't say how to do that, but it does say that they can hold the funds at a qualified custodian or via an ETF, right? So basically, someone holding the keys on their behalf. And frankly, that's probably the easiest thing to do. Of course, it comes with its own set of risks. But there's also another unique consideration in this bill, Noah, about loaning Bitcoin. Were you surprised to see that in there?
So surprised to see that. Yeah, so surprised. I think maybe this kind of brings up one contextual point. Again, I won't say to be a policy expert necessarily at the state level, except for maybe proof of reserves. I would say we're both policy experts on that front, and we've learned some things around the edges. But my understanding is, right, like states have, I think, two things that really matter here and make it maybe perhaps even more important for a state to think about the power of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Number one, they don't have as much finance flexibility to raise, essentially, right? To take on debt, to print money, right? They don't have a printing power, right? Number one. And number two, their state budgets tend to be balanced budgets largely, right? Like, yes, states issue bond measures, right? They can raise for infrastructure, things like that. They have a connection to Fed for infrastructure as well for funding, but they tend to be tighter budgets, right? They tend to be a bit more responsible.
Certainly.
And so if you have to have a responsible budget, but you have, a federal printing and fiat currency system that you're inherently tied to and you're being eroded, it feels like this is yet a more important consideration at the state level. The other thing is the political connection. I feel like the individuals in states, right, are a little bit more connected to their state politicians and understanding what's happening in their state. And so bad budgeting, bad economic management at the state level, can create quick turnover in politics. So I think folks, at the state level are looking at this and seeing the things that we are thinking, the Pennsylvania legislature's proponents, Texas, Ohio, are seeing like, okay, this actually might make a lot of sense for our state. So I wanted to kind of add that in, but let's jump into Texas. Been a very active state when it comes to crypto policy, I think for the betterment of consumers largely. So HB 1598, introduced just earlier this month. Yeah, the key features here, the one that surprised me was the donation to the reserve. I was kind of trying to think through this. First, I was like, it's like a Bitcoin staking pool for individuals. And I was thinking, wait, how are you going to manage that? No, it seems like it's a donation. So the promise in this bill is held for 5 years minimum. There is no mandate for a buy program or a total cap on acquisition or a percent of total state budget like we saw in Pennsylvania bill. It's managed, it would be managed if passed by the state comptroller, and the requirements would essentially be around custody and storage, custodianship, which is a theme across all of them actually, and a big theme to discuss around this whole thing at the federal level too. But biannual audits covering holdings, growth, cybersecurity incidents. So that warmed my heart to see that, right? From the auditor perspective, the proof of reserves perspective, definitely love to see that. Is there anything about the Texas bill that left you wanting, or?
There was some, like, it would be interesting to have maybe a purchase program or a percentage of funds like in Pennsylvania. How much Bitcoin is going to be donated here? I don't know, right? Who wants to part with their Bitcoin? But, right, you might get a tax break. We'll see what happens here. This was a note. This was also introduced by Representative Capriglione, who he introduced the proof of reserves bill earlier in 2023 as well. So he seems to be very active in introducing bills related to crypto and Bitcoin. Shout out to Representative Capriglione as well.
Shout out to him. He's very sharp, and shout out to the Texas Blockchain Council as well. I think that if you are a policymaker in a state and you're listening to this, if you're even at the federal level policymaker or leader, great organization. They may not be in your state, but their leadership, Lee Bratcher and the policy team there is fantastic, right? Jesse Goostree is a recent policy lead joiner, formerly at Fidelity, and they could be a great team to talk to. Again, it might not be your state, your exact issue, but I think they could be a wealth of information for why they helped advance this bill, right? I think that they were pretty involved in supporting Capriglione's office on this. So there's a little inside baseball for you, but great organization, and definitely reach out to those folks, look them up, Texas Blockchain Council. Okay, the last one, Ohio, and I'm kind of bummed Nick isn't with us this morning because Nick was supposed to be with us. He's sick, but he's our Ohio boy, born and bred. So I know he was excited to talk about this one. HB 703 passed and introduced December 17th.
Yeah, and this one, the treasurer is the one with the oversight to manage this one. It enables the treasurer to invest. They call it interim money, which I'm not sure. Maybe that's a legal term. Interim money of the state and amounts deposited to the Ohio Bitcoin Reserve Fund in Bitcoin. So that's any Bitcoin acquired also has to be held in one of the following ways. So this is directly by the treasurer through the use of a secure custody solution. So maybe that's his ledger. No, this is probably maybe like a Fireblocks kind of full MPC solution. Perhaps I'm not exactly sure what they intended by this, or by a qualified custodian, which is a whole other point. There's not many qualified custodians in this space, but what does a qualified custodian mean? That means like a bank authorized to hold cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, or trust, or some other licensed institutions, right? So your run of the mill exchange isn't going to be approved here to hold, a state's Bitcoin.
But also self-custody, right, was in the Ohio bill, which I thought was pretty impressive.
Yes, I'm interested to see how this shakes out on the self-custody front, because on one hand, it's a lot of risk, right? Because now you're the subject of the hackers. But on the other hand, it's risky, especially if you're a state or a country, to rely on a third party to hold the keys on your behalf, because now your enemies, they don't need to just break you, they can just break your service provider. And think about how much risk that introduces into your whole arrangement. So it's just a whole subject of its own. But yeah, very interested to see how this whole custodial arrangement works out for all these states and at the country level.
We should do a follow-on topic on this, because we worked with clients a lot on custody. We audit, we've audited exchanges and Bitcoin mining, many custody arrangements. And we understand all of them pretty well. So that would be a really good one to talk through. Like, what are the options actually? What does self-custody actually mean? Like, how could you actually affect a self-custody program at this kind of level? I mean, I'm a big believer in self-custody because I've worked in third-party vendor management and risk assessment and audit, like SOC 2, SOC 1 for years. And there's always risk, right? But like, you're just always balancing between managing your own risks directly or managing risks at a vendor level. And this is one where, yeah, really, really important, right? There's a data breach is a data breach. A Bitcoin hack is something different. So common themes here, though, right? To summarize, so we got bills are pretty concise, pretty readable. So definitely encourage folks to pull down these bills that we mentioned and check them out. I think that they will go through the sausage grinder. Of course, they're going to change. We've seen that happen in our own work, where things come out the other end looking quite a bit different than you would imagine. But reserves are managed by treasurers, comptrollers. This is generally the responsibility given in these bills. There's qualified custodians mentioned, right? So as Jeremy just mentioned, banks, trusts, potentially an ETF, like a public fund with a regulated custodian underneath, and no real purchase programs like we were talking about at the federal level. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Maybe these bill sponsors just didn't want to sort of too fine a point on the monetary aspect, except for Pennsylvania, which mentions a 10%. So you could kind of see a proxy if you look at the state budget.
Yeah, what's politically viable at this stage? A lot of your constituents don't even know what Bitcoin are. Start out slow. I get it. There are some unique elements to different state bills as well. Like, right, Texas has their donation approach, right, which is unique. We'll see if that takes hold in other states that have this introduced. Pennsylvania was the only one to have this cap, right? Even allude to the investment amount, which is 10%. So I think that makes sense, right? And that's what we see like in corporate strategies, right? There's like a percentage of capital allocation here. So that's interesting to see. Pennsylvania also had the Bitcoin loan optionality, which gives the treasurer the option to loan out Bitcoin if it doesn't introduce any more substantial risks to the fund. That could be another episode as well, but I just found that very interesting, and we'll see how that plays out too, because it's just a whole different set of considerations there when you're loaning your Bitcoin. And lastly, Texas was the only one to actually have anything specific related to reporting on storage or your audit protocols. This will obviously be very important going forward, and we'll see it in the federal bill as well. But yeah, it's interesting to see the differences and the commonalities at the state level.
Okay. Do you want to, should we circle back to the federal bill?
Let's do it.
We talked about, Cynthia Lummis's bill. Okay, let's get into the details here. Let's maybe ping pong these back and forth. We talked about the theme of who is it overseen by. Here will be the Secretary of the Treasury. We've got an appointee there and a confirmation process for a bunch of appointees upcoming. We'll see what happens there. In terms of the reserve details here, I think there's quite a bit more than we've seen in the state bills, right? So distributed facilities is interesting. It seems to be a preference towards a essentially federal self-custody system, right?
And it makes sense, right? Like we talked about, like, do you really want to rely on a custodial provider here?
Yeah.
Probably not. Yeah.
So is this
Especially
going
if
to
you have a
be?
million Bitcoin, right? The Bitcoin Fort Knox, or yeah,
Yeah.
Fort Knox.
I think we were joking internally the other day, right? Like, is this like the briefcase, right, with the
Yeah.
nuclear codes and the key, and also the Bitcoin key?
Yeah. You get your key shard and you get the nuclear codes and you get into office.
Right, right. I mean, I think the federal government on the one hand, yeah, has we've got nukes, that are sort of the software is run on these massive floppy disks, and it's like decades old infrastructure, which is a little scary. But also, yeah, of course, the federal government has a lot of capabilities to store cryptographic information securely, right? National Institute for Standards and Security. Might have
NIST. Yeah.
missed. Why am I messing that up? Standard I've worked with before. But anyway, yeah, like tons of stuff around cryptography. And for you, maybe slightly conspiratorial minded folks, maybe you think they even created Bitcoin. So they might know about it better than anybody. So another
But
thing is, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say that you can tell though in the bill, which is nice to see, is that they're taking this pretty seriously, right? It's their collaboration with the secretaries collaborating with the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and other industry experts. Like that tells me, okay, you kind of get it, right? This at least a little bit, right? This is a national security interest, and it's almost like a military or defense initiative, right? So I was glad to see that it actually mandates that they would be working with these different departments within the government.
Absolutely. Yeah, and outside providers too, I think as well will be critical here. And supportive. So, and then, yeah, purchase timeline. We mentioned, right, you've got roughly 200K. This one does have a buy program mandate, 200,000 Bitcoins per year for 5 years, total of a million Bitcoin. And then that Bitcoin held for 20 years. So exclusively, any gains, it seems like, exclusively for the purpose of extinguishing federal debt, bring those debt levels down. And then, yeah, limited sales post 20 years. So max 10% in a 2-year period.
Yep.
Pretty
Yep.
strong long-term commitment there.
Yeah. What I thought was cool too, especially as we see these state bills introduced, is that in the federal bill, there is this program where the states can actually contribute funds into the federal SBR
Mm-hmm.
effectively and use their infrastructure for holding their reserves, and it'd be in segregated accounts, assuming they have their own segregated wallets. We'll see how segregated they are, but that's pretty cool, right? If you don't want to have the infrastructure at the state level, maybe you're a smaller state or you don't have the expertise, this could make a lot of sense.
100% agree, because we would just talk through all those issues, right? Like, a bit about the security issues, the custody issues, the state level participation. This, yeah, just gives them a window basically to participate in a secure way. So that's really cool.
Yeah, there's of course, risks with this, right? If you're a state, you have your separation of powers, right? State and federal. Do you want them holding all your money? Maybe the Confederacy would have not have wanted that, but hopefully there's no civil wars on the horizon. Hopefully this would be all okay.
Yeah. Now, if you don't know Jeremy and I already, and you don't know the network firm, and this is your first introduction to us, let me tell you, we are huge proponents of proof of reserves. We don't like to take too much credit, but we were, critical in advancing proof of reserves, this concept, into the sort of, I guess you could say, professional or standards space by doing the first ever proof of reserves under CPA attestation standards. And we've continued to do multiple types of proof of reserves for different use cases in the crypto space. We believe in it because we think that it is a meaningful step forward in transparency. It's something that consumers deserve. It's a regulatory tool that's very powerful that regulators don't have largely in their hands right now. And, we've seen regulators and policymakers start to see that, right, in advanced proof of reserves legislation. And so I was really happy to see proof of reserves, in Senator Lummis's bill. And so let's talk through those federal requirements. I'll go first. I think there was a quarterly reporting component, which I love. That's probably, to me, that feels like an ideal cadence for this sort of exchange provider or custody provider type of reserve. It's, it's 400% more, 4x more frequent than an annual financial statement audit. It's 100% focused on sort of the piece of the balance sheet that you really want to see reserved in this context. And yeah, it would cover holdings transactions, which is interesting one I want to talk about, and cryptographic attestations must be published. So this is something we do. We're very familiar with. The cryptographic attestation is actually the digital signature aspect of this that shows in a cryptographic sense, right, those Bitcoins were there at a point in time and controllable still at a point in time. No lost keys, right? It's really important.
Yeah, what's very interesting about this is that it implies a public disclosure of the addresses, right? Because if you're going to publish the cryptographic attestations, for anyone to know that these are accurate and true, you actually have to publish the input to those attestations, which includes the public addresses. So that's interesting because now if you have your public addresses publicly disclosed, everyone now knows your transaction activity related to those public addresses. I don't know if I would do that. I go both ways on this because I love the transparency, but it's very interesting from a national security perspective. What could be gleaned from this? Maybe, you have your SBR fund over here, and then you actually have like maybe your operational something else right at the governmental level that's not the SBR. But it is very unique because you do lose a lot of privacy when you publish these addresses, transactions, etc.
Right. And so this goes to like the third party audit aspect that is in the bill as well. So independent auditors must have expertise in cryptographic attestations. And there is, right, this sort of independent firm participation in auditing the reserves or attesting to the state of reserves. And the point you bring up, I mean, we've done this again for many years, and this is a real concern with clients as well, custody providers, whether they're exchanges or dedicated custodians. And we've broached this before. We've reported, for clients in both ways, right? Where it's very transparent as to exact public addresses or public wallets, and also a little bit less transparent as to specific wallets, but us putting our opinion and our signature on the fact that we had what we believe is a complete set of wallets. We did digital signatures, and here were the outputs, right? Essentially. So, yeah, I think that this could end up being something that's slightly, I don't want to say obfuscated in a bad way, but right, like not necessarily listing of all the public addresses where this Bitcoin is stored, but the auditors sign off that it was there, right?
Yeah, and last thing I'll say on this, on the federal level, is that they actually mentioned proof of reserves. It's not an asset liability reconciliation. It's nothing like that. It's mentioned by name, which is great because that's actually a crypto industry native term, right? This was coined by the industry, and now it's being adopted because it's just a good idea.
I think that that's right. Like at the end of the day, like good ideas will just win out, right? Things that are better, more transparent, faster, stronger, easier. Easier is not always better, but yeah, they'll win out, right? In the marketplace of ideas. And proof of reserves matters because it's a trust builder. Is it perfect? No, nothing is. But it's transparency, right? It can reassure constituents and regulators. It's the way I say it, it's a regulatory tool that's really powerful. And again, regulators do not have access to this right now. They're looking at financials 3 months after the year. They're looking at a sampled balance sheet. They're maybe looking at a financial statement audit that didn't even include reserve assets in the scope, right? So this is a meaningful step forward. There's a self-verification aspect too, right? Ensures that these funds remain secure and accounted for. And there's a global credibility aspect if we're talking about on the national and global stage here. Yeah, I think that providing some transparency to other nation states bolsters, the U.S.'s economic position here. I won't go down this rabbit hole, but I did think about how transparent were we about our gold reserves. And there's an interesting arb there. There's a very interesting game theory piece to this, but I won't dive into that right now.
Yeah, those are great points, right? It's because this is a part of the promise of blockchains and Bitcoin is the auditability, the transparency, the borderless nature of it. Like these things are very important. And now, like if you're trying to have foreign relations, right? You're trying to have a trade agreement. You're trying to have loans between countries. You want to have someone buy your debt, right? If you can prove you have these assets, just like you're a company or a person going through a vetting process to get a mortgage, this is the same thing. And now you actually have a verifiable, you can't even lie about your reserves anymore. Like this is very interesting and unique. So this isn't just for the federal level, right? I think I want to talk a little bit about this, why proof of reserves matters, of course, for countries like we mentioned, but for cities and states as well. And what might some of those challenges be if you're, let's say you're a mayor or the treasury of a city, right? What are those challenges and considerations that you might want to think about if you were considering a strategic Bitcoin reserve, at your corresponding level? No, I know that the federal, they talked about a quarterly reporting frequency, but what other frequencies might be out there that a mayor or a state legislature member could think about in their Bitcoin reserve bill?
Yeah, I mean, stablecoin issuers, right, largely don't have a mandate to actually do a proof of reserves report or a reserves attestation type report. But it seems like it's become table stakes, right? It's been the price of entry essentially for trust to do a monthly report. And so you see the largest stablecoin issuers on this sort of monthly cadence reports delivered a few weeks to a month sort of after the point in time. I think that provides a ton of transparency. I mean, it's 12 times as much as a financial statement audit, and again, much more specific to the core subject matter. But at the same time, like, these are blockchains. These are immutable ledgers that are publicly available, and everyone can run a copy. And there's tons of great data providers that can get easy access. So that's real-time visibility. If you think about addresses being disclosed, there's like this self-confirmation, like anybody can go and confirm. So there's the self-auditability, right? That's always been a big piece of the blockchain space. If it needs to be obfuscated, like we talked about, and there's, not direct addresses made available, which I think is a reality probably, there's intermediaries and third-party auditors that can do this too, right? We've developed the world's first actual real-time attest system based on using blockchain data as sufficient audit evidence and being able to test and roll this asset liability matching into an actual report under AICPA standards. And we do that over many billions of dollars every day. So this is very possible. The network firm has proved this out. This thesis has been proven. Now it's just about people understanding it further, the technology proliferating a bit outside of our firm even more, others trying to do this same thing.
And if you think about it too, like, this is actually less complex than most proof of reserves, because in proof of reserves, there's an asset liability, usually for an exchange or for a stable coin. You have two sides of the equation. But here you don't actually have like a distinct liability that you need to
Right.
have reserves over. So it's really half the equation. So that really makes this, of course there's nuances, but it's even less, it's only half as challenging as a traditional proof of reserves, which is just great. Makes
100%.
this possible to do more frequently, easier.
Yeah. And then, of course, in the audit world, we care a lot about disclosures. The standards care about disclosures. So, I think some of the challenges here are, again, the total holdings. The transactions piece, I think, brings up something interesting too. This sounds like, again, 20-year hold. So basically nothing on transactions except buy transactions, right? That's interesting. I think being able to see strike price and entry price in a public way is interesting, but it does, again, bring up some potential security concerns around the custodian, the venue that's used, and things like that. And then, yeah, we've talked about it, but signature proofs, I think that's important to think about. This cryptographic verification being super important, but also providing the proof publicly provides maybe a bit too much information for a nation state at this time. I think that's where it'll land. Yeah. So, yeah, I think policymakers need to get educated and think through what is the right level of disclosure. There is no standard form for this. The gap there's no gap or IFRS on these standard disclosures right now, is there? So, but I think it's a balance between transparency and privacy.
For sure.
And then I think the last thing is auditor expertise is something that we face every day in this space. And we call them friends in the industry, right? Like, we're at this intersection of the crypto industry, the digital asset industry, and the CPA industry. And we know all the folks in this space that have chops, have tools, have capabilities, experience, and we know those that don't. And the vast majority of CPAs just don't deal with this in anything other than maybe like the tax reporting level. And they don't even do the data piece. They just get the numbers from the client, right? So there's a very low supply, frankly, of qualified individuals and qualified firms. And so I think, got to be able to handle large scale operation, essentially, many addresses to the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, right? It's kind of stuff that we test in. Cryptographic tooling, like how is the auditor going to cryptographically verify wallets, right? They need digital signature tools. They need digital signature tools specific to the signature scheme that was used for that wallet, to the type of wallet. So when I say the type of wallet, right, like, it's a Bitcoin wallet, but SegWit versus native SegWit versus Taproot versus other, right? So, and then there's the blockchain analysis part of this, just the ability to explore blockchains, point in time balances. So yeah, not just a simple audit, right? So who can do this, Jeremy?
Yeah, I was going to say, of course, if you're looking for someone to help on your reporting for your strategic reserve, of course, you have your CPAs that have expertise in the space. And you might, having other credentials like a CISA, Certified Information Security Auditor, could be valuable. or even a cryptocurrency security standard auditor could be valuable here too. Of course, CPAs and the AICPA have the most robust and developed standards that these could be reported under. So we'd recommend that. And that's what we are as well. But I would ask them if they have these other credentials as well, because it could be handy.
100%.
Yeah, and that's like from the reporting perspective, right? If you're a city, a state, or a country, there are a couple other things we don't want to dive too much into, but we do want to give you some things to think about, right? If you're going to introduce your bill, what are the things that you should just have at the top of your mind? Maybe you don't need to address all of them, but just think about it, and then maybe they may or may not make its way into your bill. So I think the first one, right, is we in a commonality in each of the state bills that was introduced, and even in the federal bill, was think about your custody model, right? Who should be able to hold your Bitcoin on behalf of your city, state, or country? Is it going to be a third party custodian? Are you going to self custody? Are you going to use collaborative custody, right? Maybe you don't need to make it specific in your bill, but you should start be thinking about this, because this might be this probably is the most important security consideration of this whole reserve that you can make. No, what's another one that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, 100%. We got to go deeper on that custody one, like I said earlier, because people use these terms very flexibly. Sometimes it'd be good to get to like the brass tacks, what each one of these are. Insurance, like, this is something we've started to see develop in the private market. We've seen insurance markets start to cover custody providers, exchange providers holding these digital bearer assets or digital commodities. When there's no federal backing or there's no FDIC for crypto deposits, let's say. So I think that insurance is important here. Maybe is there a public insurance fund that would make sense given the potential risks?
Well, yeah, if you think about it too, like at the city and even a smaller state level, like you could probably find insurance, right, from a big insurance provider. Of course, at the nation state level, it's going to be hard to get 1 million Bitcoin insured, but yeah, at the smaller level, I definitely think there's going to be options out there for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there could be a couple interesting policy ways to do that, right? Like reinsurance type of vehicles at the state level, or yes, the national level, even potential like limited bond issuance, right? Sort of, issue more debt, jokingly, but
You're
I think
going
there could be a mechanism, right, where you could
yeah,
meaningfully insure the reserves, but at a below cost that it would be at market. I think there's a balance there between like, anyway. So financial caps and considerations, I think this is really important. You mentioned a great point about like transparency among nation states. If we're talking this nation state level, if we're talking about, states having a window to the Fed level reserve, like these things become really important. Like, okay, well, how much are we investing? What's the time horizon here? What are the rules and boundaries around it? What are the transparency that I'm going to be able to get? And so I think this is a really important part of this that the state bills mostly don't talk about, except Pennsylvania. But yeah, budgeting, I think, is a huge piece of this. I think external advisors around custody, overall policy, the public policy aspect of this, and the reserve management are going to be critical things to think about and search the marketplace for knowledgeable people. Like policymakers need to start talking to experts.
Yeah, you need to have a budget, and then you need to think about like the financial, if you're going to have caps, what percent are you going to invest, right? These are some of the actual practical financial things to consider as part of this, because it's not going to be free.
Exactly. Yeah, policies and process around reporting, I think, is another thing. This probably gets established at probably like the agency level in terms of like rulemaking. So, but I think, the policymaker can think of, okay, what is the right legislative language to say, thou shalt, right? The department, the treasurer, the comptroller shall do X, Y, and Z, because these are really unique issues around policy and process when it comes to managing digital assets. It's just different. There are a lot of best practices that apply. So you can look to NIST, you can look to these new frameworks like CCSS you mentioned. You can look to aspects of ISO 27001 and SOC 2 and blah, blah, blah. But none of them are a perfect fit for what is needed in this context. So yeah, a little bit of inspiration from outside existing best practices and frameworks, but also the new stuff as well. And then, and then there's tools out there too, right? Like these subledgers that track crypto activity, I think are an interesting way for a department, a treasurer. I mean,
know their gains, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How is their treasury doing, right? I mean, of course, you could probably calculate it, but maybe you want to automate it.
Yeah, because if you don't have a completely cold storage approach, like the 20-year hold for federal, if the state approach is actually a slightly more managed, like you said, like you'd see it in a corporate level, it's actually based on a working capital. Like, okay, let's just based on our working capital ratio, here's how we're going to buy, and here's the times that we would sell, right? If that's the case, then you really want to know how you're tracking your inventory, what your cost basis of those coins is. Yeah, that's an interesting piece that comes in. And then interacting with the people, right?
Yeah,
Right.
well, I think about it because part of this,
lend me
like,
your ears.
yeah, well, the thing, yeah, you're a politician, or you're subject to being maybe appointed or to a vote from your constituents, right? There's an aspect of this that's you need to think about your public perception, right? So when you think about what you're putting into your bill, think about, okay, well, what are my constituents like? Is it a retirement community in Florida, or is it a tech forward place in Silicon Valley? You might think about what things you might include in your bill, depending on who your constituents are, because practically some things are going to be more viable in some places versus others, right? So this is the practical reality of it, is to think about, okay, well, maybe in the heart of Silicon Valley, you can be a little bit more technical, and maybe in the retirement community that understands money and inflation, maybe that's more of the messaging, like you see the treatise in the Pennsylvania state bill. Thinking about these things and how they are going to be perceived is an important characteristic of this.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this point. I think in a high inflation environment that we've been through, post pandemic, you saw political elections across the country with incumbents overturned largely because of management of COVID and management of this inflationary environment post COVID, right? The US happens to be in a good position. We sort of outpaced every other country on an inflation basis. So we still had a high inflation environment though. And I think that this is like national debt, state management of funds are all issues actually pretty top of mind across the spectrum. I would say that's like 70, 80% of the middle of the country generally understands that something needs to be done here, right? There's too much gridlock in Washington. There's too much debt. We're just having a debt ceiling fight in Washington right now. So these issues are super ripe. And I think communicating from the policymaker's perspective, if you can communicate to get over the crypto bro aspect of this, to get over what crypto might have been in its very earliest days, and make the economic case and make it simply and rationally that a reasonable allocation to a hard money asset, a modern version of hard money, if we'd done it 10 years ago, right, we'd be flush, right? If we do it now, it's still a reasonable chance at a hedge in inflation, and a protection of the citizens, it's not the citizens' wealth per se, but of the economic, sustainability of that government, whether state or federal. So
there's fertile ground here, right? And it's about communicating that, which is for sure very interesting. Last thing to just say, as you're considering drafting up your bill, of course, we talked about making a budget, but what are some of those key budgetary roles that you might consider, right? You're going to think about, you're going to need a custodian or some sort of custodial arrangement. And you're probably going to need some expertise to help you out with that. You might want a project manager or someone that's crypto native or understands digital assets in your cabinet or what have you to help you out to be able to manage this. And then you're going to want to make sure that you have a treasurer that's understanding of this too, because as we've seen in some of the states, right, it's the treasurer, the comptroller, the currency. So you're going to want to just make sure that you have those parties at least start thinking about this. Of course, there's going to be more that are going to be involved, but these are probably going to be the key players in your arrangement as we think about this. Very excited about this. We think, and we advise, or we recommend that you really look into this, because Bitcoin's role as a strategic global asset, I don't think it can be overstated. As we see federal governments, we see Wall Street, we see financial markets, all these different parties starting to realize this and running through the door. Countries or entities that fail to adapt, there is the risk of losing influence, prosperity, power, your standard of living. So this is very important to at least consider and understand what's at stake here, and so you can make the best decision. No, before we go today, I do want to play a quick game of a questions of city, state, or nation, and I have a few questions for you, and you should respond if it's relevant for the city, the state, or the nation to consider when for these different topics that I'm going to ask you about. So I'm going to ask you a question, and you'll respond city, state, or nation. You can respond with multiple. It can be multiple of them.
So
it doesn't have to be one of the answers. What's that?
I have to reply for each of them?
Yeah. They could be quick. All right. So at what level should you consider creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve?
State and nation, for sure. City gains the benefit of the state's program.
At what level should you consider using a custodian?
Immediately, if there's not a robust custody option or like a Fed window, as I've started to call it, like a Fed participation.
So you'd say, so would you say like a state would consider actually using a third party custody solution, like a custodial provider, a custodian holding their keys?
A state net would have less resources to do their own self custody system. I think for some low level holdings for a period of time, they could manage it, but speaking broadly, I would say that custodians, probably banks regulated by that own state, trusted qualified custodians within that state are probably the go-to provider early on. And then again, like the Fed window, if there's access to participate in the Fed's program, you don't have to build your whole infrastructure. I think that is probably a winning recipe for a state.
At what level should you publicly report?
Day one, but I'm all about transparency. So I'm biased on that one.
So is that safe to say that at any level, right? You think it's beneficial if you're a city, state, or nation? All of those would make sense?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly new and novel, especially at like a state level to do something like this. And so buying the public trust in an honest way through transparency is just a no-brainer. Like it just has to be part of the equation in my mind.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. How are you going to sell this and say, hey, we're buying this magic internet money and no one can see it?
Yeah, exactly. You have to make it quote unquote tangible, right? Like you got to give some assurances around this strategy for sure.
At what level would you consider loaning your Bitcoin?
Ooh, that's a complicated one. That one really hit me sideways on the Pennsylvania bill because I think, okay, so at what level? I think there could be a mature reserves program that enables the treasurer to have some discretion around lending. I think that could be a future because look, leverage can be nasty, but it is a fundamental part of any financial system and market. Like there needs to be the potential for leverage on capital. So I think that is a thing. I just think, look, it's paper Bitcoin, right? And we've actually done a lot of work with Bitcoin lenders over the years. It gets incredibly complex incredibly quickly. If you look at the collapses of mid 2022 and end of 2022, the mid especially, when the water went out and folks were found to have their shorts down, right? A lot of that was because of the paper Bitcoin in the system, the Bitcoin denominated loans in the system, which were essentially customer assets of Voyager and Celsius and potentially Genesis as well. Genesis was the lendee, but anyway, there was significant lending there that was, the risks were not properly controlled. In hindsight, we could see just so. I don't love this early on in the program. I think this is a maturity level. This is 3, 4, 5, even more years in where some very small percentage could be used as leverage. And I think that makes sense in that context because if you think about Bitcoin still being net more volatile than like a gold assets or other commodities, then it could make sense, sort of having an unrealized loss position to essentially make the balance sheet productive, right? To earn interest. But again, yeah, long answer, but only at a high level of maturity.
Yeah. If just make sure you go by the old adage, if you don't know where the yield is coming from, you are the yield. So I'd be very careful about this whole process. There are some legitimate strategies like the carry trade, right? Buying spot, selling futures, but are you the one managing it? Or do you know who's doing that for you? Of course, yeah. A lot of questions.
Right, like a reserve to the carry trade or a delta neutral strategy that's properly managed, which is an option strategy, right? It would have to be an outside provider. Yeah, but again, at maturity, like let's do the basics first.
And then at what level would you consider hiring external experts for reserve management, reporting, custodial management?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of folks at the federal level who are pretty well tuned on the technical aspects here. And so I think that there's probably a lot of resources there that could be tapped sort of internally from the government. If there are any more Schedule F employees around next year, I'm not sure. But assuming there are, then I think the Fed is ahead here. On the state level, I think it's immediately because I just don't, I don't imagine that at most, the vast majority of states, there's, internal resources for this. I certainly think the internal auditor's office and other IT and security and state security folks should be involved, but I think the help of outside experts is almost baked in, necessary.
Even more so at the city level too, right? Probably less resources.
Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. Well, wow, we covered a lot today, Noah.
We did. I love it. It was a conversation sort of outside the norm, right? Normally we're focused on the issues, that are facing sort of industry players and, crypto on-chain organizations and crypto companies, this was definitely a little bit of a divergence from that, but I think it still is useful for that sort of main audience. We've just sort of bolted on another audience here. And I hope that this does reach the policy maker level. If you are a policymaker, a staffer, someone interested in public government, share this around. I think that there's some honest and good faith approach to the content here today. And look, as the world shifts towards a new financial paradigm, I think the decisions made today will echo for generations. I think we've given you some good underpinnings to think that that's net true. And, from cities exploring innovative custodial solutions to nations drafting legislation for SBRs, one thing is clear, like the race to lead the global economy of tomorrow is already underway. And so if you are a policymaker, a crypto enthusiast, even a curious observer, a citizen, understanding these dynamics is, I don't think, any longer optional. It's kind of essential. It is essential. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into policies, power plays, and the practicalities shaping the future of money. Do not forget to subscribe for more insights and strategies that help you stay ahead of the ever-changing and evolving world of crypto. Until next time, this is TNF Takes, helping you build trust, drive innovation, and secure your place in the next era of finance. Stay bold, stay informed, and we'll see you on the next TNF Takes. Thanks so much, Jeremy.
Thanks.